Some strange people think that it is possible to be a Bolshevik without working every day, every hour on training one's will, one's character. One must constantly tend to this matter in order not to slide into the swamp of the petit bourgeoisie. A real Bolshevik constantly forges and polishes himself. This quote from Alexander Ostrovsky, the author of the famous Stalinist novel How Steel Was Tempered, is part of a specific Soviet culture of self-transformation that was particularly intense during Stalinism. The Western culture of self-cultivation, which is also referred to as self-techniques, subjectivation, self-care, or the art of living, can be traced back to ancient Greek philosophy. The tools and techniques of self-transformation include the study of philosophical texts, diets, travel, confession, prayer, purification, psychotherapy, diaries, meditation, abstinence, and physical exercise. In this video, I want to explore what the practice of self-transformation looked like in a socialist society, namely the Stalinist Soviet Union. One objection to the very possibility of this question is that the Soviet Union was a totalitarian society that suppressed the real self of its citizens and thereby prevented any kind of self-cultivation. The citizen was only a passive object, oppressed by an omnipresent ideological apparatus and therefore unable to work on him or herself. In the common understanding of totalitarianism, it is assumed that in a totalitarian state, the private self is the true, spontaneous and natural self, while the official self is distorted by the power of the state. The state denies its citizens the ability to express their true selves and creates an official ideological self that is forcibly imposed on the private self. The Soviet diaries that the historian Jochen Hellbeck presents in his book Revolution on My Mind, Writing a Diary Under Stalin, show that this theory has its limitations. The presented diarists did not just passively absorb the ideology, but actively worked on themselves. They turned their self into a project that is as individual as it is collective. They did not just give up their selves and replaced their inner life with propaganda, becoming empty machines. The inner struggles of these diarists show similarities with the spiritual testimonies from religious diaries. The diarists struggled with nagging doubts, felt a strong urge to confess, sought spiritual guidance, wanted to purify themselves, and tried to align their thoughts and actions. And they wanted to become part of a special community, not just in name, but as a member whose soul was in harmony with the spirit of the collective. It is noteworthy that many diarists used the language and concepts of official Soviet ideology not only in public, but also in their private conversations with themselves. Some diarists went so far as to divide their self-transformation into 5-year plans and celebrate early successes. They used dialectical materialism as a principle for self-development, adhered to the dogmas of socialist realism, and so on. In reflecting on Stalinism, we should not make a general distinction between a true but repressed private self and an ideological public self and regard compliant citizens as soulless individuals. They were ideological actors in their own right. The examples will show a complex interaction between individuality and ideology. I am talking here of souls, although the Soviet Union was officially anti-religious. Yet the word soul is often used in non-religious contexts, and the communist diarists use the word as well. Even Soviet officials sometimes refer to it. Stalin, above all, is known for calling on the Soviet writers to become engineers of the human soul. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union strongly promoted socialist self-transformation. A new society was in need of a new man. The entire culture was repurposed for the communist project. Theater plays, movies, paintings, architecture, holiday festivities, sport, newspapers, parades, radio. All of it celebrated the communist project, gave people the feeling of being part of a community, and propagated working on oneself to become a true socialist man. The ideal practices of achieving an authentic class consciousness were working in a factory and engaging in officially sanctioned social activities. However, self-transformation could also be achieved by writing autobiographies, confessing in party trials, or reading revolutionary literature. Writing a diary was also one of the officially propagated tools of self-transformation, but it was considered less reliable as the aforementioned methods. Some communists regarded diaries as a bourgeois practice. Bourgeois diaries harbor the danger of idealistic introspection, an endless dialogue with oneself. The idealist's diary has only interpreted the self. The point, however, is to change it. The Bolsheviks believed that a diary written in a communist style could aid in the project of becoming the new man and at the same time be useful as a chronicle of socialism. Literary circles were set up in factories where experienced writers taught proletarians how to become chroniclers of both the construction of socialism and their self-transformation into the new man. Workers presented and discussed their diaries in the literary circles, and excerpts of diaries were sometimes published in newspapers for motivational purposes. Still, keeping a diary could be dangerous, especially during the Stalinist era. The secret police often confiscated diaries and used them as evidence, but not as evidence for engaging in the bourgeois practice of keeping a diary. On the contrary, in a perverse way, the secret police had the highest respect for diaries. They were seen as a true testimony of one's inner life. Diaries were literally used as proof of thought crimes. For this reason, historians previously assumed that most people in the Soviet Union stopped writing diaries during the terror or falsified the accounts to please the secret police. But it turned out that this was only the case to a much lesser extent than assumed. Many people, particularly those engaged in self-transformation, kept writing in their diaries as before. I will present 3 examples of communist diaries from Hellbeck's book, one successful and one failed attempt of self-transformation, and one attempt of purification during the Great Terror. The first example is that of Leonid Potemkin. Leonid Alexeyevich Potemkin was born into a poor family in Poisava, a small village in Tatarstan. At the suggestion of his teacher, he began writing a diary at the age of 14. Early on, he set himself the goal of overcoming the limits of everyday life, as he phrased it. His great dream was to attain a leadership position and become a role model for other men like him. From the outset, it was a project of communist self-transformation. But he also noted many personal deficiencies that prevented him from achieving the qualities of a leader, in particular his weak nerves. He hoped that by joining the working class, he would undergo a metamorphosis that would turn him into a precious and hard diamond. In order to develop the psyche and create a strong personality, he left school a year earlier and joined the working class. But his encounter with the Soviet working class was disillusioning. They drank, swore, wore rags, were infested with lies, and seemed to have nothing in common with the propagated image of the socialist man. His salary was so low that he could not afford warm clothes, and the work was physically so exhausting that he had no energy left to join the party or engage in any form of social activism. His self-transformation stagnated, and he was desperate for guidance. In 1932, he found what he was looking for, a manual for self-transformation. The Culture of the Will by Ivan Nazarov was a scientific treatise on psychophysiological training. It advocated training the nerves and reflexes through conscious impulse regulation, deliberate muscle relaxation, breathing techniques, gymnastics, proper diet, and autosuggestion techniques. Furthermore, Leonid Potemkin changed his job and moved into a small one-room apartment, which he decorated according to his new training plan. I cleaned up and made the room comfortable. On the bare wall near the bed, I hung a map. In the front, on the pier, a portrait of Maxim Gorky and a clock. On the bulkhead, a portrait of Lenin sitting in his office. And lower, over the desk, a calendar. On the desk are books, an inkwell, pen, pencil, and a notebook. I voraciously read the characterizations of Lenin, making his personality traits the standard to which I aspire. He began to study engineering and geology, but his transformation was accompanied by sorrowful and pessimistic thoughts about his personal shortcomings, his weak nerves, his fragile psyche, and his nagging doubts. At one point he consulted a neuropathologist, but his only therapy consisted of blaming Potemkin's parents for his weak nerves and prescribing him some useless sour medicine. In his diary, he mentioned that those around him saw his mixture of high intellect and weak body as proof that he belonged to the intelligentsia, and an official investigation into his social origins was carried out. Nonetheless, over the next few years, his personal development gained momentum. He wrote that both his physical health and his grades improved. He noticed how women began to take interest in him, and he was able to impress his teacher and the other students with his vast knowledge of dialectical materialism. He made so much progress that in 1936 he stopped writing in his diary. A new phase of his life began, and he chose a new tool for self-transformation. Instead of writing to himself in a diary, he began a correspondence with a woman named Zirkova, whom he had met through his sister. They began a platonic relationship and supported each other in their self-development. They gave each other their diaries to read and exchanged letters in which they sincerely expressed their inner world. Potemkin and Zirkova acted as confessors for each other, rebuked each other when someone deviated from the official ideology, and tried to give each other spiritual support. However, they never regarded their correspondence as a private matter and openly shared the content of their letters with others. Transparency was one of the main virtues of the new socialist man. Karl Marx had described the coming socialist society as a completely transparent society, free from all the fog of ideology that obscures the actual social reality. In keeping with this ideal, the new socialist personality also had to be completely transparent. In conclusion, Leonid Potemkin's self-transformation was highly successful. He became a well-trained geologist, a respected leader, a cultured man, and he even wrote a manual for self-transformation entitled Strategy of Life for Young Soviet Men and Women. Whenever he experienced failures, he interpreted them as deviations from the socialist reality around him. Like the art of socialist realism, his diaries were not intended to imitate reality as faithfully as possible, but to depict the emerging socialist progress. We do learn some details about the terror from his diaries. For example, that his teacher, who initially encouraged him to write diaries, was sent into administrative exile. But these events are only rarely mentioned. The reality he tried to portray was that of his unfolding revolutionary consciousness and the transformation of his life. When Leonid Potemkin published his diaries in the 1980s, he was disappointed that readers suggested that he was a mere careerist and that they could not recognize his sincere project of self-transformation. And indeed, the existential fulfillment Leonid Potemkin found as a Soviet citizen cannot be denied. Stepan Filipovich Podlupny was born into a family of relatively wealthy peasants in Ukraine. His family was dekulakized in 1929 and his father was deported to a gulag. After an adventurous journey and a few lucky coincidences, Stepan and his mother managed to find accommodation and work in Moscow in 1931 using forged documents. They tried to keep their origins a secret, which was not that easy. Party officials noted that many peasants went into the city to find jobs and escape the horrors of the war against the so-called kulaks. They feared that class enemies could be hiding under these new workers and urged caution. But Stepan did more than to conceal his origins. He was ready to reconstruct his whole life and become an exemplary communist. Not only to survive, but also to find a community, feel less lonely, and be part of the historical project that was unfolding. In 1931, Stepan found a job at the Pravda printing plant at the Red Proletarian Street. In the same year he began to write a diary, which he continued till the end of his life. The first pages are full of writing exercises. He could only write Ukrainian, and Russian was a foreign language to him at the time. Consequently, his early diary was full of grammatical errors. However, he made rapid progress, was accepted into the Komsomol, the youth organization of the Communist Party, and became the editor of a war newspaper. These newspapers were often used to publish critique and self-critique. The first person he denounced in this newspaper was a female worker named Borodako, who underperformed at work. After her denouncement, she had to undergo a background check, which made Stepan aware that he had to keep up his outstanding work to not be discovered. From the very beginning of his new life in Moscow, Stepan Podlupny actively engaged himself in the policies of normalization practiced by the Soviet regime. He extolled the norms of discipline, socialist competition, and achievement, prodding his co-workers not only to conform to them at work, but to adopt them in all spheres of life. He joined a literary circle to become a better writer, and started to not only use his diary to learn Russian and write down events in an objective tone, but as a tool for self-transformation. He began to write about his inner life. He referred to his diary as my soul friend and mirror of my soul, but also as rubbish heap for all the stuff that stressed his mind. Above all, it became a training ground for developing class consciousness. His desire to purify himself and to become a real member of Soviet society fastened. Naturally, the first thing on his list was reading Marx and Lenin, but he quickly turned them down in favor of revolutionary novels and visits to museums and theaters, always looking for guidelines for his self-transformation. In the winter of 1933, he used all the money he had saved to pay for an analysis of his handwriting by a graphologist. To his delight, he diagnosed a wide range of positive characteristics, including a strong willpower. Stepan Podlupny's diary revealed an obsession with willpower. Stalinism propagated willpower as the defining feature that distinguished the classes. A proletarian was someone who could endure any struggle and hard living conditions and achieve greatness. Stepan repeatedly denounced his weak psychology as well as the weak-willed individuals in his environment. In 1933, his mother received letters from starving family members in Ukraine. While his mother was devastated, he tried to react as cold as possible. Half of the people have died of hunger. Now they are eating boiled beet tops. There are numerous cases of cannibalism. All in all, what's happening is awful. I don't know why, but I don't feel sympathy for this. It has to be this way, because then it will be easier to remake the peasants' smallholder psychology into the proletarian psychology that we need. And those who die of hunger, let them die. If they can't defend themselves against death from starvation, it means that they are weak-willed, and what can they give to society? There's a good chance that Stepan projected the hatred of his own perceived weakness onto the starving peasants. They embodied his weak psychology and his tainted origins that he desperately wanted to erase. The state's behavior towards class enemies was ambiguous, changeable, and arbitrary, and he wished for a clear set of guidelines he could follow to become a real Soviet citizen. With some short periods of relative peace, Stepan lived in an environment of constant witch hunts. From his diary we know that there were frequent work stoppages at the Pravda printing shop caused by mishandling of technical equipment by untrained or exhausted workers. What followed were rituals of callings to unmask the saboteurs who tried to bring down the Soviet state. Probably due to his outstanding work performance, Stepan was approached by the secret police to work as a secret informer. He accepted but instantly regretted his decision that he could not revert. His anxiety grew even more. In 1934, he wrote a poem in his diary about his fear of being unmasked. His secret weighed heavily on his soul, and he felt a strong urge to confess. After a few illegal political conversations with a friend at work, that friend began to trust Stepan and started reciting poems he had written about his personal unhappiness and the hardships of life. It left Stepan with ambivalent feelings. He was impressed by the courage of his friend compared to the career-minded state parrots, but he also felt that his critique of the political order was pessimist and petit bourgeois. It seemed to be the opposite of the optimistic and confident socialist personality of state propaganda that he wanted to become. His inner turmoil only intensified. In his diary he wrote that there were two people inside him. One of them is a bureaucrat who reminds me every day, stay on your guard, observe the rules, be very careful, don't talk through your head, watch yourself and what you are saying. He always gives me instructions. This person lives in me most of the time. The second person, he's someone who collects all sorts of dirt in my soul, all the leftover garbage, and he waits for the right moment to pour the stinking mess over someone else's head to relieve himself from the burden of this dirt. Stepan had worked incredibly hard and was able to become a shock worker and a member of the Komsomol. but he never felt like the propaganda suggested, and he could not shake off the feeling of living a lie because of his concealed class origins. My successes in production work don't make me happy. A thought that I can never seem to shake off, that sucks my blood from me like a sap from a birch tree, is the question of my psychology. Can it really be that I'm different from the others? In 1936, Stepan's Kulak origins were made public. He was expelled from the Komsomol, and severe consequences for him and his family loomed. As the events of the Great Terror began to unfold, his project of self-transformation eroded, and he stopped writing in his diary. From January 1st to December 5th, 1937, there is not a single entry in the diary. The entry on December 6th starts with, "No one will ever know how I made it through the year 1937. No one will know because not a single day of my life this year has been illuminated in this so-called diary. I can't even recall the details of my life in this year myself, and even if everything turns out all right, and there are only 3 more weeks to go, I'll cross it out like an unnecessary page. I will cross it out and banish it from my mind, though the black spot, the massive, ugly black spot, like a thick bloodstain on my clothes, will be with me most likely for the rest of my life. It will remain because my life during these 341 days of 1937 has been as ugly and disgusting as the clotted blood that oozes out in a thick red mess from under the corpse of a man dead from the plague. The feelings a man has who's not used to the sight of blood and sees a scene like that or recalls it, that's what I experienced when I go through my memories of the past year." But the year was not over, and the worst things were yet to come. Only a few days later, his mother was arrested in the middle of the night and vanished without a trace. Stepan desperately tried to find her over the next weeks, standing in line at the information window at the Moscow militia office at 5 in the morning. A line that extended for half a kilometer. When it was his turn, he had a panic attack. It was the first time that he lost his cool in the outside world. Eventually, he found his mother in a Moscow prison, but she could only tell him that she was sentenced to 8 years in prison for concealing her class origins. After this event, the style of his diary changed. Instead of a tool of self-transformation, it became a document for the naturalist fixation of facts, as he phrased it himself. It was an act of dissidence, since he must have known very well that, according to socialist realism, this is the wrong and illegal kind of realism that only shows the facts of Soviet life without the optimistic context of emerging socialism. After the arrest of his mother, his identity fell apart. Stepan Podlupny's sincere attempt of self-transformation had failed. When he submitted his diaries to a state archive in the 1990s, he also included a highly edited version with many commentaries. His self-transformation failed so bitterly that he had completely reinterpreted his diaries from the 1930s. He denied ever having undertaken such a project and saw his diary solely as a historical document of a victim of an inhuman regime. When Joseph Tarshis joined the Bolshevik underground organization, he was given the name Osip Piatnitsky, derived from Piatnitsa, the Russian word for Friday, because he was as devoted to the revolution as Friday was to Robinson Crusoe. After the Bolshevik coup, he became one of the high-ranking communist functionaries in the Soviet Union. But on July 8, 1937, he was arrested by the secret police. His arrest plunged his wife, Yulia Piatnitskaya, into a deep life crisis. She was an engineer and just as loyal to the party as her husband. 10 days after her husband's arrest, she began writing a diary. Who was her husband really? Or could it be that the party was in the wrong? These haunting thoughts undermined her identity as a Soviet citizen, and she tried to regain her footing by reminding herself that she was serving a higher truth. Proof, not for others, but for yourself, that you stand higher than a wife and higher than a mother. You will prove with this that you are a citizen of the great Soviet Union, and if you don't have the strength to do this, then to the devil with you. But the arrest also had serious consequences for her professional life. She lost her job and her place in the collective. The separation from the collective caused her great pain and threatened the core of her identity. I looked through the March issues of Mechanical Engineering. Every day that I live pushes me further back. New machines are being built, lathes, agricultural tools, machines for the metro, for bridges, and so on. Engineers are raising in new ways questions of organization and the technology of tool production. In general, there is no doubt that life is moving forward, regardless of any spokes in the wheel. The wonderful palace of culture for the car factory. I'm downright envious. Why aren't I in their collective? The whole family was socially isolated. Misfortune has some sort of smell. Her sons lost all their friends and stopped going to school. Her eldest son only left the house at night and was eventually arrested and sent to a forced labor camp. Yulia Piatnitskaya used her diary as a tool to release her poisonous thoughts. Before his arrest, her husband acted as her confessor. I told him everything, although I caused him pain at times, and we'd had our quarrels, but my soul was untroubled. I felt like an honest person. I didn't hide anything from Piatnitsky. Now she had no one left to turn to. When she expressed her doubts about the party at home, her older son chided her. "Mama, I find you disgusting at times like this. I could kill you." She also quoted her younger son, aged 11, as saying, "It's too bad they didn't shoot Papa. After all, he's an enemy of the people." The diary is a testimony of a tormented soul. It is full of references to purity and cleansing, an obsession that carried over to her sons. At one point, she mentioned in her diary that her son engaged in obsessive washing and ironing. She wanted to rehabilitate herself, but could not muster the strength to hate her husband and report him to the police, as the state prosecutor advised her to do. In her diary, she struggled with her own thoughts. How vigilantly one has to watch one's thoughts, how much one has to care for their purity, and how short human life is. Every life ought to give something to those who are close to it in spirit. Every life ought to give as much in return as it has taken from society. Yet her diary did not seem to suffice as a purging device. In her desperation, she eventually turned to the secret police as a kind of pastoral authority. I sincerely asked the NKVD for humane assistance. I asked for a harsh life for myself, but this would still be life, struggle, work, and an unmistakable growth as a person, and consequently of human and consequently civic spirit. The only thing that I would like to have is trust of the NKVD, such trust that I could speak about everything that worries me, all my grave thoughts when they appear from time to time and then go away after some work on myself, that I could speak about all this with somebody from the NKVD. I would have what I had with Piatnitsky. Osip Piatnitsky was shot in July 1938. But even after more than 220 hours of interrogation, during which he was physically tortured, he did not sign the report of his alleged crimes. By this time, however, Yulia Piatnitskaya was already convinced of her husband's guilt. Before his arrest in 1937, he had defended Nikolai Bukharin, a former member of the Politburo who was now accused of being a traitor. After reading the transcripts of Bukharin's show trial in March 1938, in which he publicly confessed to the trumped-up charges of involvement in terrorist conspiracies, Yulia Piatnitskaya condemned both Bukharin and her husband as traitors. Some diarists who survived the Stalinist purges emerged victorious and felt stronger and purer, but Yulia Piatnitskaya's soul was torn apart. Eventually, she went to a state persecutor and told him about the state of her soul. Later, in 1938, she was arrested and taken to a prison camp in Kazakhstan, where she worked as an economist. Her son was in the same labor camp, and they were able to see each other one last time. But in 1939, she was sent to hard labor in another forced labor camp after resisting the sexual advances of a camp commander. In 1940, a weak and sick Yulia Piatnitskaya was left behind by the other camp inmates to die alone in a sheep pen. Following these diary excerpts, I would like to emphasize some elements of Soviet self-transformation. In addition to the aforementioned dogma of socialist realism, the cult of the will, and the principle of transparency, the Soviet The break with the past was another important element. Self-transformation often entailed a radical break with the old self. One had to part, not only with one's old self-image, but also with one's former life. In the New Testament, Jesus said that conversion can mean that families fall apart. But communist practices of conversion went one step further and encouraged the denunciation of family members as class enemies. The party appealed to youth, especially to those with tainted backgrounds, to dissociate themselves from their fathers and denounce them as class enemies. Ritualistic declarations by sons and daughters of class alien heritage filled the local and national press, repudiating their parents and stating that they had severed all ties to them. The diarists all believed that they were living in exceptional times, and the communist project exerted a strong appeal even for individuals who initially fought Bolshevism. Nikolai Ustryalov, a professor of law, fought in the White Army and emigrated to China after the Civil War. But he was homesick, and the Soviet project began to attract him more and more. He envied the revolutionaries for their historical pathos. In 1935, he returned to Moscow to become part of the communist project. In his diary, he tried to record all the signs of the historical dawn that he encountered, and hoped that, by training himself to see the great changes even in small things, he would earn a Soviet biography, as he phrased it. In 1937, he was arrested and shot. Next to community, the diarists desperately sought guidance. Leonid Potemkin went to doctors and read manuals on psychophysiological training. Stepan Podlupny went to a graphologist and read revolutionary literature, and Yulia Piatnitskaya turned to the secret police. In ancient philosophy, the teacher played a central role in the practice of self-care, as did the priest or high monk in Christian institutions. In the Soviet Union, this function was performed by the party. Veterans of the October Revolution in particular were expected to write their memoirs and autobiographies to serve as role models for young revolutionaries and give advice to new party members. Above all, however, stood the mythical figure of Lenin. By far the most important source of motivation, inspiration and guidance was Lenin's biography, which every Soviet student had to study intensively. And lastly, self-transformation was always accompanied by doubts. Doubts that can lead to criticism. However, when the diarists began to criticize the Soviet system, they were unsure whether their criticism was only due to their personal inability to truly understand the Soviet project. Critique of Stalin was often an ambivalent and contradictory mixture of criticism and self-criticism. For example, in his diary, the history student Arkady Mankov compared his urge to criticize Stalin to masturbation, which he regarded as an unhealthy habit. Others split their souls into two parts. In the course of writing, diarists transformed themselves into sociological expressions of their secret moods. They wrote that a kulak, a bourgeois, a class enemy was sitting in their soul, poisoning their thoughts. To avert the final consequence of this logic, some diarists split themselves into two distinct voices, one Soviet and one anti-Soviet, and asserted that the critical voice did not express the totality of their selves, but was the voice of an enemy within. In a parallel to the show trials staged by the regime at around the same time, Soviet citizens thus used their diaries to put themselves on trial and to expose the inner enemy in the service of restoring the purity and integrity of their Soviet selves. This division of the soul led to surreal scenes in which innocently imprisoned diarists developed doubts about Soviet ideology, but at the same time recited poems dedicated to Stalin to their cellmates. Besides dissidents and resistance fighters, there remain two ways in which historians can conceptualize individualism in a totalitarian society without denying individuals their agency. The first is the figure of the pragmatic individual who attempts to live his or her de-ideologized everyday life alongside the official ideologized life. These individuals often try to pursue a personal agenda outside the system. They tried to play the game of official ideology in order to gain access to housing, food, jobs, and so on, and tried to bind the system to their own needs. The historian Stephen Kotkin described these individuals in his book Magnetic Mountain as judo fighters trying to deflect an overwhelming force against itself. He wrote, Even when the weight of the force against one is seemingly overwhelming, as was the case with the Soviet state, the possibility remains to sidestep and thereby use the heavy force against itself. This concept of individual agency under totalitarianism is based on a challenge-response scheme in which the pragmatic individuals always react to the official ideology. On the other hand, we have the individual who is committed to the ideology in a non-pragmatic sense. Pragmatic individuals can be non-believers, semi-believers, and even believers. But the believers under the pragmatists tended to see Marxism-Leninism more as a simple scientific fact or a reality they can't escape, while the ideological subject took it as a truth that can only be attained through a rigorous transformation of one's own identity, which required extensive work on oneself. This deep connection between truth and self is another element of self-transformation that dates back at least to ancient Greek philosophy. The diarists are examples of individuals who not only tried to arrange themselves pragmatically with the ideological apparatus, they wanted to understand the communist project in a deeper sense and make it their own. And yet, these two subjects were not completely disconnected. Like the pragmatists, the diarists wanted to advance their careers and feared the loss of privilege, imprisonment, loneliness, and death. Stepan Podlupny, for example, tried to play the game of official ideology in a pragmatic and tactical way. He falsified documents to get a job in Moscow and denounced other workers so as not to appear suspicious himself. At the same time, however, he sincerely tried to become a true communist and live up to the ideals of Soviet ideology. According to a common understanding of totalitarianism, Soviet citizens could only cultivate their inner self in a secluded private sphere which shrunk the more influence the official ideology gained. In this view, self-cultivation always stands in opposition to the ideological apparatus. But the diaries published after Perestroika paint a different picture. Although some Soviet citizens were able to profit from the Soviet culture of self-transformation, its acceleration under Stalinism reached an intensity that tore many souls apart, and the Great Purge unleashed a psychic terror that only few could withstand. And it caused a widespread exhaustion in the empire that would show itself in the later periods of the Soviet Union.